Good evening and welcome to Bookmark. In 1969, two young researchers met at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. They were both young psychologists and they began to collaborate with each other on their work. It was a wonderful and rich friendship, and after about 40 years of their collaboration, they were able to present to the world a whole lot of insights that have changed our thinking into how human beings think and why we take the decisions we do and why we argue in the ways we do. And the book that we are going to look at that was written by one of those gentlemen. His name is Daniel Kahneman, and this book is called Thinking Fast and Slow. His collaborator was a young man called Amos Tversky. Before this book came out, Tversky had passed away, and therefore, when the Nobel Prize was given for this work, for the work that the two of them did, it went to Daniel Kahneman and could not be shared by Tversky. We know that Nobel Prizes are never given to anyone who is dead. If you're planning to win one, do it when you're still alive. What did these two gentlemen do? They designed a number of experiments to find out why people take the decisions that we do. The experiments were very sophisticated, designed extremely carefully, because they wanted to get from the results of the experiments valid findings about what was going on inside the heads of human beings. One of the things that they discovered was that human beings thought in two different ways. Kahneman and Tversky give it the name. They suggest that we have two different ways of thinking, and they named one System 1 and the other System 2. System 1 is what happens when you think very fast. It's instinctive. Most of us think using that system almost all the time. He gives an example. If you ask somebody what is 2 plus 2, the answer comes out immediately, 4. If you ask somebody what is 284 divided by 328, nobody is going to give you an answer immediately unless you are a Shakuntala Devi. You need time. Sometimes, as in my case, I will need not only time but a piece of paper, and after that a calculator, and after that the help of somebody to find out if my answer is correct. So, the first way of thinking, which is done by the mechanism that they metaphorically call System 1, is fast thinking, and the second one is slow thinking. So, thinking fast and slow, the title can be explained like this. They also discovered that human beings are prone to a number of errors, and they gave names to these errors. I'll give you some of those, they're very interesting. The halo effect, the availability heuristic, the affect heuristic. A heuristic is a kind of rule of thumb that we use when we think. Intuitive heuristic, demand effect, framing effects, cognitive illusions, the law of least effort, and associative activation. These are some of them. There are many more, and following these people, other psychologists have discovered even more. All this has broadened in an unimaginable way our understanding of how people actually think and how they take decisions. And we understand today much better how biased we are in our thinking normally and how error prone we are. Because one of the things about thinking fast is that we rarely are correct. But there's one thing about us, which is that after we take a decision using System 1, fast thinking, we will use our slow thinking method, System 2, to justify our actions. Inside the book, Kahneman describes these in great detail. They're very simple. You don't have to be a statistician or a mathematician or even a psychologist to understand this. This book is meant for the layman. He has 5 parts in it. After describing these initial things, he talks about 5 different aspects in 5 different sections, and they are: part 1 is about the basics of how part 1 works, or system 1 works and system 2 works. Part 2 is about the difficulties of thinking statistically. Apparently one of the most difficult things that a human being can do is to find sense and meaning, the correct meaning, where somebody presents you with statistical information. Part 3 looks at the puzzling phenomenon of excessive confidence in a lot of men who imagine that they know much more than they do. He calls it the illusory certainty of hindsight. Part 4 is on economics, which he tells us and which he shows is not a rational science. Remember, economics is based on the idea that it is a rational science, but no, he says it is not. And the last part is a wonderful part on the experiencing self and the remembering self. They're very different from each other. And he gives us a wonderful set of examples to convince us that they're different and that the connection between them is actually rather tenuous. There are some very interesting things about the book. Number 1, Kahneman's tone is very modest. He tells us that I'm just providing vocabulary for people who gather around the water cooler in an office to talk. They'll be talking about human thinking, but I'm not doing anything great. He doesn't say that, but he implies that he doesn't think this work is of great value. But in fact, it is such great value that the first time Nobel Prize was given to psychologists was this. Why was it given to psychologists, although there is no Nobel Prize for psychology? That is because it was given as a prize under economics. We'll come to that later. So, he doesn't make any great claims. One interesting thing is that he never refers, although he's talking about the mind and thinking, to say somebody like Freud. I would have thought that he would do that. No, he doesn't. He doesn't refer to an Aristotle or a Plato or a Saint Augustine. Indeed, he ignores the whole classical and medieval word. There's not a word about any one of them. Why is that? That is because Tversky and Kahneman were depending entirely on the experimental method. We know that the experimental method is recent, and anyway, they are not looking for the experiments to corroborate something that an ancient thinker has said. They are using the experiments to discover something about human thinking. The second thing is that there has been some criticism about this work. The criticism comes from people who say that actually man being a social animal, thinking itself is a social activity, and that aspect has been ignored by Daniel Kahneman and Tversky. I think there is something to that argument. We need to look at that a little more closely. Whatever it is, you must remember that this is a book that is a landmark in understanding how human beings think. And it has some interesting consequences. One, it has influenced a whole lot of people in a range of subjects. But I'm going to talk about the unfortunate impact it has had. The unfortunate impact it has had is that when one first read the book, it came out in 2011 or so, I thought, now that we know how many errors we are making, maybe we will learn how not to make the errors. Or maybe we'll learn how to spot the errors and to have discussions so that the choices we make, particularly as corporate bodies, as governments, and so on and so forth, they will be more rational. That hasn't happened. What has actually happened is that this work and the findings of Tversky and Kahneman are mostly used by marketeers, mostly to sell stuff to people who do not want them in the first place. I suspect that they've been perhaps more used by somebody like the Russian IRA, which Prigozhin ran until yesterday or day before yesterday, when Putin has taken it over from him. It is probably behind more fake news and misinformation, and is probably being misused more than it is actually being used. And as I said, where is it actually being used? Much of it is being used in marketing, which I think is really a terrible thing. But it does have a lot of spin-offs, as I said, and one of them has resulted in this book. This is George Marshall, and the book is Don't Even Think About It: Why Our Brains Are Wired to Ignore Climate Change. So climate change, some people call it a climate emergency, is a huge existential problem, but the public ignores it. Why? Marshall goes to Kahneman to find out why people do not think about it at all. Now, Kahneman and Tversky collaborated for about 40 years, and this book is a summary of the work that they did. Unfortunately, there were some problems and they split after this long and terrific partnership of 40 years. But Kahneman is still working in the same area. And a couple of years back, this book came out, Noise, A Flaw in Human Judgment, where with the help of two co-authors, he looks at more or less the same phenomenon. Wonderful. The examples will grip you. This is a book on the friendship between the two. It's written by Michael Lewis. It's called The Undoing Project. And it is about this landmark in intellectual investigation into how we think as we think. I hope you'll read Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow. I'm sure it will grip you and perhaps change your mind about the world and how it works, particularly how human beings think and how we behave. It's absolutely brilliant. If I were to think of it, looking at the history of human thought, I would think of this as a most important landmark. A footnote: there's a book that I must recommend very, very strongly. It is by a lady called Janice Barriott. It is titled Everything the Light Touches. It's an extraordinary novel, and I have to make a strange comparison when talking about a book. This appears to be a novel that is more like a flower than like any other novel. It is difficult to describe in very brief, but all I will tell you is that much of it is set in the Northeast. And the Northeast is in our mind very often these days. The tragedy that is happening there is such a moving one that I think all of us keep an eye on what is going on and keep hoping that the bloodshed and the violence will end. This is a book basically about the botanical world, but at the same time it is told with immense gentleness, immense subtlety, like a flower. That's why I compared it to a flower. But we learn a lot about the culture of the tribes in the Northeast. It will actually help us, therefore, although the book is not directly political, to understand what is happening there. But apart from understanding what is happening in, Manipur, the book is a wonderful read. Just imagine a novel where Gethe is a character, where Linnaeus is a character, but which is also set in contemporary India, where in the first person, the author, a Delhi-bred girl, goes to Shillong and then goes to visit her old ayah, who lives in a small village where there are hardly roads and no transport. And from there, we get lost in the world of the tribals and the world of nature. A beautiful novel. Pick it up. Thank you very much.